Hello, I'm Kristen from Wild Birds Unlimited Berry and Newmarket. Welcome to our channel and don't forget to subscribe. This webinar is all about nuthatches, the upside down bird. So just a brief outline of the presentation. Here's what we're going to cover. First, we're going to look at some general nuthatch information as a family of birds, and then we're going to take a closer look at the two species found here in Ontario. Finally, we're going to finish with ways that you can encourage nuthatches to visit your yard. Nuthatches belong to the family of birds known as Sittidae. There are 29 species found all over the world, and most of the species are found in Asia, where there are 15 species of nuthatches. In Canada and the US, we have 4 species of nuthatches, and here in Ontario, we have 2, the white-breasted nuthatch and the red-breasted nuthatch. Members of the nuthatch family Sittidae share several key features in common, but these do vary by species. In general, they have a compact body size, roughly the same size or a little bit smaller than that of a chickadee, if you're familiar with those birds. They have short legs featuring strong toes and long claws for gripping tree bark and other rough surfaces. They have compressed wings, square-shaped tails with 12 feathers, long, sharply pointed bills, and with respect to their plumage coloration, many nuthatch species are blue-gray or brown in color on their backs and heads, with the underparts lighter in color, usually a white, maybe an orange, buff color. Again, this varies by species. As a family, nuthatches also share some common behaviors. They are very agile birds that can creep not only up, but also down tree trunks. Just a side note to say that woodpeckers will only travel up trees, so it's easy to distinguish nuthatches from woodpeckers because of the characteristic way that nuthatches will travel not only up, but also down trees. They're also very comfortable foraging for food and feeding upside down. And the name nuthatch refers to the behavior that they exhibit where they take a large seed, nut, or insect and wedge it into the crack of a tree or another surface. I've seen them use brick before, for example. And they hack at the food item with their strong beaks, breaking it into smaller pieces that they can then eat. They are well known for hiding or caching nuts and seeds to retrieve at a later date when food supplies may be lower. And they also vocalize quite a bit and have a wide variety of sounds that they make. I thought it would be interesting to include the story of the Bahama nuthatch, although it is a little bit of a tragic tale. This is a species that in recent years was thought to have been extinct, and then some individuals were found, and now it's presumed that they may be extinct again. In 2004, there was a population of roughly 1,800 individuals, and then a series of hurricanes came through and killed a bunch of the pine trees that the birds are reliant on. In 2007, only 23 birds were observed by researchers, and they thought that after Hurricane Matthew in 2016 that the birds might have gone extinct as a result of all the hurricane damage. No birds were observed at all by researchers in June of 2016, but in 2018, researchers surveyed about 250 miles over 6 weeks and spotted 6 birds. So who knows what's going to happen to this species of nuthatch after other hurricanes have come through the area. Unfortunately, no birds have been spotted in the last few years. While a few individual Bahama nuthatches may still exist, this is a species that is likely facing extinction. This cooperative breeder heavily relies on its family groups to raise young, and with the absence of these groups, successful reproduction is highly unlikely. Furthermore, even if breeding populations remained, inbreeding would likely lead to genetic problems and an increased susceptibility to disease, further jeopardizing the species' survival. But certainly, we will keep our fingers crossed that the Bahama nuthatch is able to hang on. Here are a couple of other nuthatch facts. Here in Canada, as well as the US, particularly in regions that experience harsh winter conditions, nuthatches are really well known for joining mixed flocks during colder months as a survival strategy. The more eyes that are available in a group of birds to look for predators, the better the chance that those birds have for survival. Different birds have different preferences with respect to caching seeds, and nuthatches are a type of bird that seems to prefer caching seeds without shells. For example, peanuts without shells or sunflower seeds without shells. Whereas other species of birds, blue jays for example, prefer caching nuts and seeds with the shell intact. So you may want to keep this in mind when choosing what to put in your bird feeders during the early fall months of September and October, when these birds are really seeking out nuts and seeds to cache. Here's an example of caching behavior. I took this photo after I watched a red-breasted nuthatch take a peanut without a shell from my hand. It then proceeded to find a nearby tree and stuffed the peanut in between the pieces of bark. Something I find really interesting about nuthatches is that some populations of birds will migrate as a survival strategy. So for example, some populations of red-breasted nuthatches are eruptive migrants. This happens when a large group of birds moves south in the fall and winter when food supplies are scarce or low. So during some winters, we will see more red-breasted nuthatches than others. During eruption years, they can also be found outside of their preferred habitat of coniferous forests. So if you live in a subdivision, for example, that is dominated by deciduous trees, you might see more red-breasted nuthatches in eruption years. The predators of nuthatches are similar to those of other native songbirds. Birds of prey are a primary predator of nuthatches, including hawks such as sharp-shinned and Cooper's hawks, which specialize in predating other birds, as well as falcons and smaller owls. Domestic outdoor cats are another major predator, as they are with a wide variety of songbirds, small mammals, reptiles, amphibians, and more. With respect to nuthatch nests and eggs, they experience competition from a wide variety of other birds and mammals such as squirrels. Particularly troubling is the competition that them and other songbirds receive from house sparrows and European starlings, two invasive species in Canada, the United States, and many other parts of the world. Animals like snakes and raccoons will also predate their eggs and nests full of young. To help protect adult nuthatches from predators, having your feeders placed within 20 feet of mature trees, particularly coniferous or evergreen trees, is very helpful in providing them with some shelter to escape predators. But please be aware that outdoor cats can sometimes hide in trees with low dense foliage, so they can ambush birds at bird feeders. To mitigate this, what you can do is prune back the lower branches so the birds can see the ground clearly, or keep your feeders further back from the trees. Ontario is home to 2 species of nuthatches, which we are going to explore in more detail. We're going to start with the larger of the 2 species, the white-breasted nuthatch, which obviously gets its name from their white underparts. They are around 13 to 14 centimeters long with a wingspan between 20 to 27 centimeters and weigh approximately 18 to 30 grams. Their coloration is quite striking. Their backs are covered in a beautiful blue-gray color. They have a darker blackish blue cap and a white face and underparts with a very rich chestnut color under the tail. Males are darker in coloration than the females, which we will look closer at in a minute. And they are primarily found in mature woods and woodland edge habitat, particularly associated with larger deciduous trees such as maples, oak, and beech. They can behave a little aggressive towards other birds at times. They use wing flicking and tail displays as a way to intimidate other birds. As I mentioned already, male plumage is slightly darker than the females, so they are sexually dimorphic, meaning that males and females can be discerned from each other by the coloration of their plumage. However, their plumage variation is much more subtle than in some other species of backyard birds. For example, male and female cardinals that are very easy to visually identify even from a distance. I have a photo here of both the male and the female, and the male is on the left, the female on the right. Hopefully, you can see, comparing these two photos, that there is a visual difference between their plumage, and that the female's plumage is noticeably lighter in color than that of the male's. The red-breasted nuthatch is the smaller of the two species, and it's named for its rust-colored breast. This species is 11 centimeters long with a wingspan of 18 to 20 centimeters and a weight of between 8 to 13 grams. This little bird also has some quite stunning plumage. It's got the similar blue-gray color to that of the white-breasted nuthatch on the back, and it also has a black cap, black eye stripe, a white eyebrow, and rusty cinnamon-colored underparts. As with the white-breasted nuthatch, the males of this species are also darker in coloration than the females, and their habitat preference is a little different from that of the white-breasted nuthatch. They prefer coniferous forests or woods with species of trees like pines, hemlock, cedar, fir, and spruce, for example. Although in eastern North America, they can also be found in deciduous forests as well. As I mentioned, the red-breasted nuthatch is also sexually dimorphic. Males and females can be told apart visually by plumage alone. And as with the other species, the males have darker plumage than the females. But again, it's a subtle difference. The easiest place to observe the difference in the plumage coloration is in the richness of the rust color of their underparts. So I have a photo here. On the left is a male and on the right is a female, and I'm hoping that you can see from these photos that the color variation in particular of the breast and belly is much more rich and dark in the male than the female. So hopefully you can get a general sense of the overall contrast in color using these two photos. All right, we're going to move on to 3 ways to attract nuthatches to your yard using foods and feeders, water, and shelter and nesting habitat. Let's start with food. Before we jump into looking at the supplemental ways that you can provide food, water, and shelter for nuthatches, I want to look at another way of attracting them, and that is through planting native trees and shrubs. It would be difficult to attract nuthatches without trees, and in particular, mature trees in the habitat that surrounds a yard. So if you are in a relatively new subdivision with newer built homes or one where there's not a lot of tree cover, one of the first things I would recommend would be to plant native trees and shrubs along with other native plants and get them established to create habitat and encourage the nuthatches to visit. Both species of nuthatches here in Ontario are heavily reliant on trees for everything from food, such as insects, seeds, and nuts that they're getting and foraging for in those native trees and shrubs, as well as shelter and nesting habitat that they provide to the birds. So if you want to ensure you're building habitat for nuthatches and encourage them to your yard, really planting native trees and shrubs is something that you want to strongly consider because that is going to be really appealing to those birds. There are certain foods that nuthatches are really fond of at bird feeders. And as a bird with a diet heavy in insects and seeds, it's no surprise that their favorite feeder foods are heavy in both protein and fat. Here are the top 4 favorite foods of nuthatches at bird feeders. Number 1, hands down, is peanuts without a shell. This is definitely their favorite food. They also absolutely adore live mealworms. They also really enjoy eating black oil sunflower seeds or sunflower chips. Those are the seeds without shells. And actually, if they're given a choice between the two, they generally prefer the sunflower chips. And finally, suet in many different forms, including suet cakes, as well as the spreadable bark butter suet. Nuthatches will also eat some other food items occasionally, such as safflower, and actually the birds in our yard in particular love Nutrisaf or golden safflower, and rarely they will eat small pieces of cracked corn as well. Nuthatches' favorite seeds and nuts can be offered to them in 3 different ways. So they can be offered as individual straight seeds. So for example, just sunflower chips or sunfire chips, the hot pepper version of sunflower chips. They can also be offered in seed blends, which is a combination of different ingredients, seeds and nuts, mixed together with sunflower seeds or chips as the base and primary ingredient. For example, Wild Birds Unlimited No Mess blend without millet is a blend of sunflower chips with diced peanuts and is a hit with the nuthatches and many other birds. The third way in which you can offer seeds and nuts in your yard is to use cylinders. Cylinders are a bunch of yummy ingredients such as nuts, seeds, dried mealworms, fruit, and suet nuggets or bark butter bits mixed together, and they're held together with a food grade gelatin, which is safe for the birds to eat. And they are an awesome way to feed the birds because the birds have to peck out the individual seeds out of the cylinder, and that offers you longer views of watching the birds while they're feeding. And it also attracts a wide variety of birds because there's so many different ingredients in cylinders. They are really appealing to a wide variety of birds. They are also fantastic if you are going on vacation, maybe you're going to the cottage and you want to leave some food out for the birds while you're gone. Because cylinders last a long time, that's a really great food to offer. As well as in the wintertime, it's nice to put them out because you're not going out in the cold as much to refill your feeders, given that they do last a little bit longer. So they're one of my absolute favorite ways of feeding the birds. As I mentioned, peanuts are definitely the nuthatch's favorite food. And if given a choice, often when they're presented with a seed blend, they're gonna pick out the peanuts first and carry those off to eat. If you're watching them, you might notice that they pick up a peanut only to drop it and pick up a different peanut to take away. Like blue jays, they are weighing the peanuts to figure out which one is the heaviest, and then they take that one to either eat or cache. The largest peanut or the heaviest peanut probably contains the most oil, which means the birds are getting the most fat and protein, which is why they are exhibiting that behavior. So here's a quick video I took of a nuthatch feeding on peanuts from my hand. And here is another quick clip of a red-breasted nuthatch enjoying seeds at a cylinder. A close second, or maybe even tied for their favorite food with peanuts, would be live mealworms. Nuthatches absolutely love them. Mealworms are a beetle larva. They come in a little container and they do need to be stored in the fridge. And I know that that can make some people uncomfortable. But if you have a little soda fridge or somewhere out of the way that you can store them, they are definitely worth offering in your yard. They're a very, very popular backyard bird feeding item because of how much the birds love them. Typically, nuthatches and other birds will want to eat live mealworms, but they do come dried as well. And I find that the dried are most successful when offered as a part of a seed mix or in a seed cylinder. You can offer live mealworms year-round, and during the nesting season, you're probably going to find that your nuthatches are eating more of them and seeking them out more because they will collect and take mealworms back to the nest to feed to their young. Here's a short clip of a white-breasted nuthatch during nesting season, eating and collecting mealworms for its nestlings. Suet is a food that's extremely high in fat and protein, and one of the most common visitors to the suet feeders in our yard are nuthatches, particularly during the winter months. They seem to prefer suet that contains a higher amount of peanuts and tree nuts in it, and they also like suet that has dried mealworms. I've been offering the Wild Birds Unlimited Super Suet because it does have a lot of nuts and it also has dried mealworms, and they really love it. Suet is available in a lot of different forms. Most people are probably familiar with suet cakes, which traditionally, I guess, were fed during the colder months of the year, although they can be fed year-round if you have a shady spot to put your feeder during the warmer months. There's also no-melt variety suets, which have a higher melting point, and they can be offered during the warmer months as well. You can also find suet in the form of cylinders, plugs, which are small, long cylinders, suet nuggets called bark butter bits, and those can be added actually to seed mixes and put in some of your seed feeders, as well as spreadable suet, which is called bark butter. Bark butter is great because it basically turns everything into a bird feeder, and it has added calcium, which is really great for nesting females and baby birds. The texture of bark butter is actually an ideal food for a parent bird to grab in their beak and feed to their young to supplement their diet. It's also really enticing to nuthatches and other birds to take things like seeds and nuts and dried mealworms and press them into bark butter that's been applied to a tree branch or to a feeder. It gives them an extra reason to visit that bark butter. Bark butter has currently attracted more birds in North America than any other single bird food, with 161 species and counting thus far. Everything from hummingbirds to species of ducks have been observed eating it. Also, bark butter and many of the other Wild Birds Unlimited suet products come in a hot pepper variety, which is aimed at deterring mammals from taking an interest in the food. Birds, however, are not affected by the spicy ingredient called capsaicin, as they have a different physiology than mammals. Mammals have nerve receptors which give them an unpleasant sensation when they taste spicy hot pepper foods, thus they tend to leave them alone. So hot pepper foods can be a great way to problem solve in your yard under certain circumstances. Here is a quick clip of a red-breasted nuthatch enjoying some spreadable suet. Here are a few photos to illustrate that bark butter, the Wild Birds Unlimited spreadable suet product, can turn almost anything into a bird feeder. It can be offered in a variety of specialty feeders, but it can also be offered on tree trunks and branches, making it an ideal food for nuthatches since they spend so much time in the trees. I want to ensure that I've mentioned that a lot of the foods that nuthatches enjoy, many critters like chipmunks and squirrels also enjoy. So problem solving is important. You need to consider how to keep the critters away from the bird feeders and keep the food for your birds. Some of the ways you can do this include properly spaced poles and baffles, as within the picture here. Also, squirrel-proof bird feeders, and in particular, the Squirrel Buster line of squirrel-proof bird feeders. They work really, really well. You can also use some regular feeders in combination with cages. And the nice thing about cages for nuthatches is that they can fit through the wires really, really easily. So it won't affect nuthatches accessing the foods at all. You can use for nuthatches upside down feeders. That can be a good way of deterring some of the peskier birds like starlings. And as we know, nuthatches are really comfortable feeding upside down, so they won't have any issues using the feeder. You can use hot pepper products, and we have a wide variety available at Wild Birds Unlimited, from seed to suet products to cylinders. There's lots of options out there. And for bird houses, you want to make sure you think about adding predator guards to the entrance holes, which prevent squirrels from chewing the entrance hole and making it bigger so that it's a nest box for squirrels. Let's take a look at a few photos of problem-solving foods and feeders. So here we have a feeder called the spiral treat tray, and you can see that there's a white-breasted nuthatch enjoying some hot pepper bark butter bits. Here we have a tube feeder, and inside of that tube feeder is a hot pepper seed called Fiery Feast, and you can see that the nuthatch is enjoying those pieces of sunflower chips and diced peanuts. This feeder is called the Wild Birds Unlimited Starling Proof Suet Feeder, and unfortunately you can't see the entire feeder, but it is one of my favorite feeders that we have in our yard. The birds use it all the time, and nuthatches can access suet in the middle of the cage that goes around the feeder from either the bottom, or they can go through the wire mesh all the way around the feeder and access it at any side as well. And here we have sunflower chips being offered and enjoyed by a red-breasted nuthatch and a house finch at the Eliminator squirrel-proof bird feeder. Now let's take a closer look at the feeders that we are offering the nuthatch's favorite foods in and their placement. There are a wide variety of styles of bird feeders that can accommodate the nuthatch's favorite foods: tube feeders, hopper feeders, tray feeders, etc. I want you to keep in mind that some foods do need to be offered in specific and specialized bird feeders. For example, peanuts out of the shell or cylinders. What we also need to keep in mind, not only for nuthatches but for the other birds as well, is offering foods in feeders that they can easily access and feed from. I know that that sounds very simple and basic, but not all bird feeders are straightforward. When you're looking to purchase bird feeders for your nuthatches and other birds, there are a lot of features that you want to look for. You want a feeder that is easy to fill. It sounds simple, I know, but I can tell you that there are a lot of feeders that exist out there that are not easy to fill. You also want something that's going to hold enough food that you don't have to keep going out throughout the week to fill it back up again because it's gone empty. It's too easy for that to feel like a lot of work and then it won't get done. So my recommendation would be to look for something that can hold enough food to last at least 1 to 1.5 weeks in between fillings. For nuthatches specifically, you want to look for areas on the feeder that the birds can perch and cling onto, and preferably there are multiple places where they can do that. Just as it's important to have something that's easy to fill, it's also very important to have a feeder that is easy to clean and comes apart all the way for cleaning. At Wild Birds Unlimited, we also have a line of feeders called EcoClean, and these are embedded with silver to prevent microbes from growing on the feeders. You want to look at investing in a feeder that is built to last for many years to come. We've seen the move away from bird feeders made of wood to now bird feeders made mostly of lifetime recycled plastic material that doesn't crack or fade, metal, and also very, very durable UV stable plastic. Now I'm just talking about bird feeders here. A lot of bird houses are still made out of wood. Purchasing a bird feeder is an investment, so products with a great warranty or a lifetime warranty is important. You can ask about the warranty before you purchase the feeder, and also see if replacement parts are available and easy to get for the feeder that you buy. If you can't use a properly spaced pole and baffle to prevent squirrels from getting to your bird feeders, you definitely want to look into what the squirrel-proof feeder options are. Again, I'll mention the Squirrel Buster line of products carried at Wild Birds Unlimited. They really are the best products out there. Another thing to consider is whether starlings or blackbirds will be around your feeding station, in which case I would also recommend choosing feeder options that are compatible with cages that you can get later on to block out those unwanted visitors. I want to highlight one food that nuthatches really love, live mealworms, and that this is a food that requires a specialized and dedicated feeder to offer. There are so many different styles of live mealworm feeders out there. The important thing is to ensure that the mealworms will be in a feeder where the surface is such that they can't crawl out of the feeder. So something that's made of glass or smooth plastic or smooth metal, for example. When they're warm, mealworms will crawl around in the dish, and that is very enticing to the birds. But you don't want them to be able to crawl out and escape, otherwise the birds wouldn't have anything to eat. So you want that slippery surface to keep them inside the feeder. I love the feeders on this list, but my favorite is probably gonna have to be the barrier guard mealworm feeder because it's in a cage that the bluebirds, the orioles, the nuthatches, chickadees, smaller woodpeckers can all get into, but it keeps the starlings and grackles out. It is definitely worth the investment on that feeder. I wanted to look at just a couple points specifically about feeder placement and bird feeders for nuthatches. Specifically nuthatches because they are a bird that in nature perches on many different vertical and horizontal surfaces, and it's definitely worth looking for feeders that have those surfaces available for nuthatches to perch on. In terms of feeder placement, the best practice for many birds is to situate your bird feeder or feeding station about 15 to 20 feet near a good perching area like a mature tree. I find that the birds will generally land in the tree first. They're going to scope out the area looking for predators or other birds that they're competing with and their safety. And when they feel comfortable, then they'll proceed down to the feeder. Because nuthatches are so comfortable feeding and hanging upside down, they can be accommodated by such a wide variety of feeders and setups. Just further to that point about them landing in mature trees before proceeding to the feeder, I do notice a lot of the time they also land on the arms of our pole system, or we have these really cool branch perches that go on Wild Birds Unlimited Advanced Pole Systems, or APS poles, and they also love to land on those. So they will land in a tree first, then come down to the pole system, and then generally onto the feeder. So landing a few times definitely is a way for them to scope things out in case there's any predators or large competitive birds. And I think it's just easy for them in some cases to access the feeder first by landing nearby and then making these smaller jumps to the feeders. I always like to include a reminder that bird feeders do need to be cleaned regularly. Birds can be very messy at bird feeders. They can leave little bits of food or droppings around. And if the food is stuck in a feeder long enough and exposed to moisture, it might go moldy. Sometimes it might even sprout. We want to ensure that we are disinfecting feeders and cleaning them regularly. This goes back a little bit to selecting the feeders for your yard that are easy to clean, because when stuff is hard to clean, mold can be the result. So please clean your bird feeders as often as possible. To clean your feeders, you want to take the feeder completely apart, soak it in a 10% bleach solution to disinfect the feeder. Then you want to scrub it with a soft bristled brush or a cloth to get all the droppings off. Rinse it really well. And then you may want to consider a second wash with dish soap, which can cut through the oils found in many different bird seeds, such as black oil, safflower, and Niger. Rinse the feeder really well, allow it to thoroughly dry, and replace it with fresh food. Let's look at attracting nuthatches with water. Just like us, birds need water daily for drinking and for bathing to keep their feathers in tip-top condition. Nuthatches will happily accept water from a bird bath, so offering one in your yard for your nuthatches and your other birds is a fabulous idea. It will certainly get some great use, mostly from birds drinking, but occasionally bathing as well. I want to make note that birds are most comfortable in shallow baths. Baths that are too deep or too steep without a gradual slope tend to be used less by the birds. During the warmer months, it's helpful to add movement to the water in your bath since it's a little easier for the birds to find and hear moving water. Particularly when the bath is new, or you've put it in a new location, or you've brought it back after being in winter storage for a few months. You can use drippers, wigglers, and small fountains to get that movement in the water. And moving water also helps to prevent mosquito larvae from developing in your bath. Here's an expert tip. The copper discs available at Wild Birds Unlimited, Barrie and Newmarket, you can add to a bath to keep algae out of your bath during the warmer months, and they work amazing. Highly recommend them. In the winter, we can offer heated bird baths or put heaters in some existing baths to prevent ice from forming on the bath. They work really well, and the birds love them because they prefer to drink water rather than eating snow during the cooler months. At least most backyard bird species do. Heated baths aren't hot tubs for birds. They simply click on at 0 degrees Celsius and keep the bath free from ice and free from completely freezing over. There may be a little bit of ice around the edges, but there will be an area in the middle that always stays open for your birds. All baths, regardless of the season, need to be cleaned and filled regularly. Birds do not keep bird baths clean for very long. They leave feathers and droppings and bits of food in the bath, so refilling it every other day or so is really important. In warmer months, this will prevent mosquito larvae from developing as well. And in the colder months, the water from your bath, if you're using a heated bath, can evaporate out really quickly. So getting into a routine where you're filling your bath regularly will help to prevent any maintenance issues with a heated bird bath. A bird bath is not something you can just put out and forget about it. There is some maintenance involved, so please keep that in mind, otherwise it won't be of benefit to your birds. We're going to finish off by talking about attracting nuthatches by using nest boxes and shelter options. Both species of nuthatches found in Ontario, the red-breasted and the white-breasted nuthatch, and I suspect most, if not all, other nuthatch species, are cavity nesting birds. This means that they make their nests in holes in trees or tree cavities. As such, both the red-breasted and white-breasted nuthatches will use nest boxes for rearing young. Many cavity nesting species of birds, including nuthatches, begin looking for their nesting location and nesting habitat in March. So it's really important to have them up and ready to go for the birds in February. The species of nuthatch you can attract around your yard really depends on the habitat around your home. So if you have a lot of coniferous trees, then you're probably going to be looking to attract red-breasted nuthatches to your nesting box. Or if you have a lot of deciduous trees, then chances are you'll have a better chance at attracting white-breasted nuthatches to a nesting box. Let's take a little closer look at white-breasted nuthatch nesting. I took this photo of a nest of a white-breasted nuthatch family that nested in the cavity of one of my apple trees in our yard. It's kind of hard to make out because the tree limb is horizontal, so I placed a red dot in the photo where the cup or the top of the nest is located, and then down from that red dot you can see some of the nesting materials that the bird has used, including bark, feathers, and fur. White-breasted nuthatches nest April through June, and then in the winter months, this is also a species that will use roosting boxes, which I'll talk about in just a little bit. They like their nesting boxes to be hung on the high side. On the low end, they want it to be 5 feet from the ground. On the high end, about 20 feet from the ground. So you may need a ladder to hang out a box for white-breasted nuthatches. It needs to be hung on a live tree, or if you have a dead tree that's sturdy enough and not going to rot away, then you can also hang it on there too, provided it's in the right treed habitat. You could also try to pole mount the box if you can get a pole that's tall enough for the birds that could be included in the treed habitat where the birds would prefer to nest. To have the best chance of success, you want to place a birdhouse for white-breasted nuthatches facing south. The box itself should have an entrance hole of 1¼ inch in diameter, and you want to ensure that you have at least 1 inch of wood shavings filling the bottom of the box. They like to use it as a base to build their nest on. In terms of spacing, in the event that you want to try to offer a second nesting box for more white-breasted nuthatch families, it would have to be hung at least 1,040 feet or 317 meters away from another white-breasted nuthatch box that you have out. In white-breasted nuthatches, it is the female who primarily takes on the task of building the nest with materials like bark, grass, feathers, and fur, and will also line the cup of the nest with softer items. A good tree cavity in some habitats can be really hard to find, so white-breasted nuthatches will reuse the same tree cavity or nesting box from one year to the next. All they'll do is refresh and renovate the nest with fresh materials for the next nesting cycle. The eggs are whitish in color with speckles that are reddish brown, gray, or purple. And the typical clutch size for white-breasted nuthatches is 5 to 9 eggs, and the eggs are incubated for 14 days. They have 1 brood of young per year, and the nestlings fledge at around 25 days. Red-breasted nuthatches also nest April through June, and they too will use roosting boxes during the colder months of the year. Again, their nest boxes need to be placed a little higher, on the low end 5 feet and on the high end 15 feet from the ground. Red-breasted nuthatch nest boxes should also be placed on living trees or on poles in treed habitat, or they can be mounted on the side of a building if the building is surrounded by their preferred nesting habitat of coniferous trees. Their nests should face south or west and away from prevailing winds. One really interesting thing that this species does to protect its nest and eggs is using pine sap resin to surround the entrance hole. Now, if you've ever had pine sap on your hands, you know how difficult it is to get off. Even with soap and water, it's really difficult. This resin keeps predators out, and the birds avoid it on their feathers by diving into the box without making contact with the resin. You can see the resin really well in this photo as it's applied to the outside of the entrance hole. For red-breasted nuthatches, you need an entrance hole size on the box of 1¼ inch, and there should also be a layer of at least 1 inch of wood chips laid down on the inside of the box as a base for the birds to nest on. I should mention that I use predator guards, and in this picture, that's the black metal piece that's around the entrance hole, on any of the birdhouses that I have that they will fit because they deter squirrels and other animals from chewing the entrance hole to make it larger so that they can then take over the box themselves. If you want to try and hang up 2 or more boxes for red-breasted nuthatches to accommodate more red-breasted nuthatch families, then you will need to space your boxes at least 150 feet or 46 meters away from each other. It's the female red-breasted nuthatch that chooses the nesting site. However, both the male and the female will help to excavate the nest. The female does a little more work during the excavation, and she also builds the nest with a base of bark, pine needles, grass, and feathers. And then she builds a nesting cup for the eggs out of grass, shredded bark, feathers, and other soft materials. The eggs are a cream-colored base with reddish-brown speckles. A typical clutch size for this species is 2 to 8 eggs, which are incubated for approximately 12 days. They also have 1 brood per year, just like the white-breasted nuthatches, and the nestlings fledge in approximately 18 days. Here's a short video I captured of a nuthatch family using one of the nesting boxes in our yard. The parent feeds the babies and then is out of the box to look for more food while a little one peeks out the front. I'd like to wrap up by quickly touching on roosting boxes. I've mentioned already that red-breasted nuthatches and white-breasted nuthatches, as well as a variety of other cavity nesting species, will use roosting boxes as a way to get out of the cold on really frigid nights. Multiple birds may use them together and huddle together to stay warm. So for example, you might find an entire family of chickadees in a roosting box together. Essentially, the difference between a roosting box and a nesting box is that a roosting box is primarily used as shelter in cold weather, and a nesting box is primarily used for rearing young. Roosting boxes do not have room for nests or baby birds, and they are hung during the colder months of the year, not during breeding season. They have dowels on the inside for birds to comfortably perch, and the entrance hole is located on the bottom of the front panel as a way to trap heat in the box as hot air rises. There are also no vents on a roosting box for the same reason, to trap heat within the box. In this photo is a convertible roosting box. Essentially, it can be hung as a roosting box during the colder months and used as a nesting box during the warmer months with a few simple modifications. On the right, we have an inside view of the box set up as a roosting box. So you'll notice the dowels for perching, and you'll notice that the entrance hole is on the bottom of the front panel. On the left, we have flipped the door around so that the entrance hole is now at the top of the front panel. The dowels have been removed from the box, allowing for nest building. And while you can't see it in this photo, there's also space near the top of the box left for ventilation so that fresh air comes in and out of the box for those baby birds. I want to thank you very much for tuning in and listening to this webinar. We'd love to connect with you on social media. You can follow me directly on my social channels using the handle @KristenMartin, Kristen with an E and Martin with a Y. And don't forget to subscribe to this YouTube channel. For all things birds, please follow Wild Birds Unlimited Barrie using the handle @WBUBarrie and Wild Birds Unlimited Newmarket using the handle @WBUNewmarket. If you're interested in visiting one of our stores or shopping with us online, please look us up or visit our website. Thanks again for watching, and I'll see you again next time. Enjoy the birds!